June 4, 1943, Mexia, Texas. 1,850 veterans of Rommel's Afrika Korps stepped off a train expecting the worst. They'd surrendered in Tunisia just weeks earlier, surviving brutal desert combat only to become prisoners of the enemy they'd been taught to despise. Nazi propaganda had painted Americans as weak, decadent, barely capable of organizing a proper military. These hardened German soldiers expected cattle cars, starvation rations, maybe beatings. Instead, they climbed down from cushioned Pullman coaches with working air conditioning and dining cars serving hot meals. Through the windows during the journey, they'd seen something that made no sense. Electric lights. Everywhere. Small Texas towns blazing with illumination at night. Farms with electric power in the middle of nowhere. Factories running night shifts, glowing like cities. One German officer wrote in his diary that night, "Either we were lied to about everything, or we just lost a war we never had a chance of winning." He was right on both counts. The psychological demolition began the moment they surrendered. American processing centers in Algeria operated with efficiency that shocked German officers accustomed to Wehrmacht chaos. Fluent German-speaking American personnel, immediate medical care, Geneva Convention rights explained in detail, and the food. White bread, real coffee, not the chicory substitute Germans had been drinking for years, meat twice daily. A captured sergeant reported this to his commander, who assumed it was a trick, exceptional treatment to extract information. It wasn't a trick. It was standard American military rations. The same food every American soldier ate, every single day, across every theater of war. That realization hit harder than any interrogation could. The Americans had so much food they could feed prisoners the same quality meals as their own troops without even thinking about it. The contrast was devastating. German rations on the African front had been deteriorating for months. Bread mixed with sawdust. Canned meat that was more preservatives than protein. Water rationed so strictly that soldiers went days with cracked lips and sunburned throats. And now, in captivity, they ate better than they had as free men fighting for the fatherland. The Atlantic crossing completed their education in American industrial capacity. Liberty ships. The prisoners had heard of them, dismissed them as propaganda. Ships built in weeks rather than months, crude welded construction that would surely fall apart in rough seas. Then they boarded one for transport to America. The ship was indeed welded, not riveted. But it didn't fall apart. It was also equipped with radar, a technology most German soldiers had only heard rumors about. The prisoners watched in fascination as American crew members tracked other ships in total darkness, explaining the technology casually, like it was no big deal. On that crossing, something else became clear. The waste. Steaks cooked but not eaten, thrown overboard. Bread left out overnight, discarded. Fresh milk poured into the ocean when it turned slightly warm. A German lieutenant tried to explain to the American guards that this was criminal waste, that in Germany such food would feed a family for days. The American guard shrugged and said, "We got plenty more where that came from." He wasn't bragging. He was stating a fact, and that fact was more terrifying to the Germans than any weapon. August 2nd, 1943, Norfolk Naval Base, Virginia. The prisoners disembarked expecting, well, a naval base. What they saw was an industrial colossus that processed more cargo in a single day than Hamburg handled in a week. Cranes moving in synchronized precision, warehouses stretching to the horizon, ships being loaded and unloaded simultaneously at dozens of piers. And the vehicles, trucks everywhere. New trucks, not the worn-out, constantly breaking down vehicles the Wehrmacht relied on. American workers drove personal automobiles to the port. Personal automobiles. In Germany, car ownership was a luxury reserved for the wealthy and privileged. Here, dock workers and crane operators owned cars. Multiple cars per family, the prisoners learned. The psychological impact of this observation cannot be overstated. These men had been taught that American workers were exploited, impoverished, living in slums while capitalist overlords hoarded wealth. The evidence before their eyes told a completely different story. The train journey to their assigned camps became a mobile exhibition of everything Nazi propaganda had gotten wrong. The trains themselves were passenger coaches, not freight cars. Comfortable seats, climate control, bathrooms. Through the windows, an endless parade of American industrial might. Factories operating 3 shifts, visible by their nighttime illumination. Small towns with electric streetlights, electric signs, electric everything. One prisoner counted cars in a single small-town parking lot and stopped at 300. His hometown in Germany had maybe 20 cars total. The camps themselves were the next shock. Camp Hearn in Texas, Camp Concordia in Kansas, hundreds more across 45 states. These weren't brutal prison facilities. They were purpose-built communities constructed in an average of 90 days each. Electric lighting, indoor plumbing, hot showers, heated barracks in winter. The prisoners walked into their assigned quarters and found conditions superior to most German civilian housing. Beds with actual mattresses, lockers for personal belongings, recreation rooms with tables and chairs. One captured officer wrote, "The dog kennels in America are better than the houses I saw in Poland. The medical facilities were better equipped than most German field hospitals. American military medicine had access to penicillin, the miracle drug that German physicians knew existed but couldn't obtain. Surgical equipment was modern, abundant, replaced regularly. Dental care was provided as standard, and mental health treatment existed. Wehrmacht soldiers with trauma were told to be strong, to overcome weakness through willpower. American POW camps had actual psychologists who treated combat stress as a real medical condition, not a character flaw. The Germans couldn't process this. They were enemies, defeated enemies, and yet they received medical care that their own government never provided. The food situation bordered on surreal. 3 meals daily, each meeting caloric requirements that exceeded what German civilians had seen since before the war. Breakfast included eggs, bacon, toast, coffee, orange juice. Lunch was sandwiches with actual meat, vegetables, milk. Dinner featured a main course with multiple side dishes and dessert. Dessert in a prison camp for enemy soldiers. The American military standard required that uneaten food be discarded rather than served again, ensuring freshness. Prisoners watched American guards throw away more food after each meal than many of them had eaten in a week on the African front. This wasn't cruelty or mockery. It was procedure. Standard American military procedure that assumed such abundance that waste wasn't even a concern. Christmas 1943 brought this abundance to its peak and simultaneously destroyed whatever remained of Nazi ideology in most prisoners' minds. Over 500,000 packages arrived at POW camps nationwide. Local churches organized dinners. Community groups donated gifts. American civilians, whose sons and brothers were fighting Germans in Europe, sent Christmas presents to German prisoners. Small Texas towns invited prisoners to holiday celebrations. Church choirs sang German carols for them. One prisoner received a hand-knitted sweater from a woman whose son had been killed by German artillery in North Africa. The card said she forgave him and hoped he would return home safely after the war. By late 1943, American intelligence officers documented what they called ideological collapse syndrome. Prisoners were abandoning Nazi beliefs not because of propaganda or coercion, but because of observable reality. Requests for American newspapers, books, and magazines increased exponentially. Camp newspapers shifted from nationalist propaganda to discussions of democracy and economics. Educational programs expanded. Over 40,000 prisoners enrolled in correspondence courses teaching English, American history, economics, political science. The Germans were hungry for knowledge about how this system worked, how Americans had built such overwhelming prosperity while Germany struggled with rationing and shortages. University professors volunteered to teach advanced courses. Prisoners studied engineering, agriculture, business administration. They read American literature, watched Hollywood films that showed American society with surprising honesty and self-criticism. This openness was itself revolutionary. Nazi culture censored anything that showed weakness or failure. American culture seemed to revel in showing its own flaws, its problems, its debates. Yet somehow this open, chaotic, self-critical society had produced an industrial machine that dwarfed Germany's militarized economy. The labor assignments provided the most direct education in American industrial capacity. Due to agricultural labor shortages, prisoners worked American farms and factories. No blindfolds during transport, no restrictions on what they could observe. The authorities didn't care if prisoners saw industrial facilities because there was nothing to hide and everything to demonstrate. Prisoners worked harvest crews and witnessed mechanization that made German agriculture look medieval. Combines harvesting wheat at speeds that would require hundreds of men with hand tools. Tractors powerful enough to pull multiple plows simultaneously. Grain elevators storing enough wheat to feed a major city for months. And the ownership structure shattered their preconceptions. These machines weren't owned by wealthy landowners or government collectives. Individual farmers, some of them teenagers, owned equipment worth more than most Germans would earn in a lifetime. Farm families lived in houses with electricity, running water, telephones, refrigerators, radios. The standard American farm had amenities that German middle-class families in cities couldn't access. The factories were even more impressive. Campbell's soup facilities, where prisoners witnessed automation on a scale Germany had never achieved. Canning lines processing thousands of units per hour with minimal human intervention. Republic steel plants producing more steel in a week than some German facilities managed in a month. The Ford River Rouge complex employed over 100,000 workers producing tanks, engines, vehicles at rates that seemed impossible. And the workforce included everyone: women operating complex machinery, African Americans in supervisory roles, teenagers doing skilled technical work, every Nazi racial and social theory contradicted by observable fact. The propaganda had claimed that racial integration weakened America. The evidence showed that America's willingness to utilize its entire population regardless of race or gender created productive capacity Germany couldn't match. Prisoners watched women welding tank hulls, adjusting tolerances to microscopic precision, operating overhead cranes. These weren't desperate wartime measures. American women had been entering industrial work for decades. The war simply accelerated a process already underway. The agricultural abundance reached levels that seemed wasteful, even obscene, to men from a starving continent. Prisoners witnessed deliberate crop destruction to maintain market prices. Food so abundant that controlling supply was necessary to prevent economic collapse. This was incomprehensible. German civilians were eating turnips and potato peels while American farmers destroyed surplus grain to keep prices stable. The psychological impact was profound. Everything the prisoners had been told about decadent, weak America was inverted. This wasn't weakness. This was a society so productive that overproduction was a problem. The strategic implications were crushing. Germany had mobilized its entire society for total war. Women and children working in factories, slave labor from conquered territories, every resource dedicated to military production. And still, Germany's output couldn't match a United States that was fighting a two-ocean war while maintaining civilian living standards higher than peacetime Germany ever achieved. June 6, 1944. News of the Normandy invasion reached the camps. Prisoners watched newsreels showing the scale of the operation. 150,000 troops landed in a single day. Thousands of ships, aircraft blackening the sky. The equipment and supplies were endless. One German officer who'd fought in France in 1940 calculated the tonnage of supplies landed on D-Day and compared it to the entire Wehrmacht's logistical capacity for the French campaign. D-Day logistics in 24 hours exceeded what Germany managed in 6 weeks 4 years earlier. This was the final ideological collapse for most remaining Nazi believers. The war was over. It had been over before it started. Germany never had a chance. The industrial and organizational capacity gap was too vast. American guards reported prisoners asking the same question repeatedly. How did we not know? How did our leadership not understand what we were fighting? Some guards were sympathetic. Most just shrugged. It had been obvious to Americans all along. The numbers were public. Production statistics were published in newspapers. Anyone who looked could see that American industrial output exceeded the combined Axis powers. The Germans had looked at the numbers and dismissed them as propaganda. Now they knew better. The humanitarian treatment became another weapon in the ideological war. American camp commanders personally conveyed condolences to prisoners who received news of family deaths in Allied bombing raids. Civilian groups sent aid packages to Germany through neutral countries, specifically targeting families of POWs. The prisoners couldn't reconcile this with their understanding of warfare. The Allies were bombing German cities, killing civilians, destroying infrastructure. Yet simultaneously, American civilians sent food and medicine to those same German civilians through relief organizations. The distinction became clear. America was fighting the Nazi regime, not the German people. This concept was foreign to men raised under totalitarian ideology, where state and people were considered identical. The separation of government from citizenry, the idea that you could oppose a regime while respecting the humanity of its people, was a democratic principle that many prisoners had never encountered, and it worked. By 1945, surveys showed that less than 10% of long-term prisoners maintained strong Nazi beliefs. The rest had abandoned the ideology not through coercion, but through evidence. The vocational and educational programs prepared prisoners for post-war reconstruction. Courses in democratic governance, free market economics, modern agricultural techniques, advanced manufacturing methods. American authorities explicitly intended to create a cadre of German citizens equipped to rebuild their country on democratic foundations. And it worked. When prisoners began returning to Germany in 1946, they carried more than personal effects. They carried knowledge, skills, and most importantly, a different vision of how society could function. Former prisoners played disproportionate roles in West Germany's reconstruction. They introduced American farming techniques that revolutionized German agriculture. They implemented quality control methods learned in American factories. They established small businesses based on American models. They entered politics advocating democratic institutions and free markets. The economic miracle of the 1950s wasn't accidental. It was built by people who'd seen an alternative system and understood its advantages. The numbers tell the story as clearly as any narrative. 371,000 German POWs in American camps, 500 camps across 45 states. 14 million man-days of agricultural labor contributed to the American war effort. Over 2,000 escape attempts, but a success rate of essentially zero because prisoners had nowhere to go and, increasingly, no desire to leave. 95% rated their treatment as good or excellent. 74% reported positive worldview changes. 40,000 enrolled in educational programs. 135 camp newspapers published, most eventually advocating democratic principles. 50,000 former POWs eventually immigrated to the United States permanently, and thousands more maintained correspondence with American families for decades. These aren't propaganda statistics. These are documented facts from both American and German records, confirmed by prisoners themselves in post-war interviews and memoirs. The 1985 reunion in Austin, Texas, brought over 500 former German POWs back to America to commemorate their experiences. Old men now, they spoke openly about the transformation they'd undergone. One former Afrika Korps lieutenant summarized it. "We came as enemies and left as friends. We arrived believing lies and departed knowing truth. Our imprisonment was our liberation." Another former prisoner, who'd become a mayor in West Germany, described his captivity as the education that saved my life and my country. The Americans at the reunion were equally moved. One former camp guard recalled, "We treated them like human beings because that's what they were. The Nazis tried to make them into machines. We showed them they could be men again." The relationship between former prisoners and their captors had evolved into genuine friendship, maintained through decades of letters, visits, and shared history. The contrast with other POW experiences makes the American approach even more remarkable. Soviet camps killed millions of German prisoners through starvation, disease, and forced labor. Japanese camps brutalized Allied prisoners with systematic cruelty. Even British camps, while generally humane, couldn't match American material conditions because Britain itself was under rationing and resource constraints. Only America had the industrial surplus to feed, house, and educate hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers at standards exceeding what most of them had known as civilians. And this wasn't propaganda. The prisoners weren't isolated from reality. They saw American society directly. They worked alongside American civilians. They read American newspapers. They watched American films. They experienced American abundance firsthand. There was no way to fake the scale of industrial production they witnessed. No way to stage the technological sophistication they encountered. No way to manufacture the casual wealth of ordinary American workers they observed. The strategic impact of this approach extended beyond individual prisoners. These men returned to Germany and told their stories. They contradicted the final Nazi propaganda, claiming America was weak, divided, on the verge of collapse. They provided eyewitness testimony that America was stronger than Germany ever was, that American industrial capacity was essentially unlimited, that continued resistance was suicide. This contributed to the rapid collapse of German morale in the final months of the war. Soldiers who might have fought fanatically to the end instead surrendered at the first opportunity, hoping for American captivity specifically because they'd heard from returning wounded about the treatment POWs received. The psychological warfare was more effective than any bomb. The demonstration of prosperity, dignity, and freedom achieved what force alone never could: the genuine conversion of enemies into allies. Dr. Arnold Kramer, historian specializing in the POW program, called it prosperity over propaganda, demonstration over destruction. Every element of the American system served as testimony to democratic strength. The food wasn't just nutrition, it was evidence of agricultural abundance. The medical care wasn't just humanitarian, it was demonstration of technological advancement. The education wasn't just charity, it was confidence in democratic ideas withstanding open examination. The humane treatment wasn't weakness, it was strength secure enough to show mercy. This totality of approach created transformation that military victory alone never achieves. Defeated enemies remain enemies unless given reason to change. The German POWs were given thousands of reasons, visible and tangible, experienced personally rather than taught theoretically. The camps themselves became laboratories of democracy. Prisoners elected representatives to handle internal administration. They published newspapers with editorial freedom that shocked men accustomed to censorship. They debated politics openly, something that would have resulted in arrests under Nazi rule. They organized theatrical productions, sports leagues, educational societies, all with American encouragement rather than suppression. This wasn't chaos. This was democracy in action. The Americans understood that telling Germans about freedom was useless. Showing them freedom, letting them experience it, letting them practice it in a controlled environment, that created genuine understanding. By the time prisoners returned to Germany, they'd lived under democratic principles for years. It wasn't theory, it was their lived experience. The agricultural work revealed another dimension of American society that shattered Nazi stereotypes. Prisoners expected to see impoverished farmers worked to exhaustion by capitalist exploitation. Instead, they found prosperous family farms where 14-year-olds drove trucks worth $5,000, where barns had electric lighting and mechanized milking equipment, where farmers discussed commodity futures and crop rotation strategies with sophistication that would impress university professors. German agricultural methods relied on intensive manual labor and traditional techniques passed down for generations. American agriculture was mechanized, scientific, constantly innovating. The productivity difference was staggering. A single American farmer with modern equipment produced more food than 50 German farmers using traditional methods. And the American farmer lived better, worked fewer hours, had more leisure time, and enjoyed a higher standard of living. This wasn't exploitation. This was efficiency creating prosperity. The industrial facilities provided similar revelations. Prisoners worked in factories and witnessed labor relations that contradicted everything they'd been taught about capitalism. Yes, there were bosses and workers, but workers had rights, negotiated wages, could quit and find other jobs, belonged to unions that actually bargained with management. The relationship wasn't feudal or exploitative. It was contractual and, while not equal, far more balanced than anything in Germany's highly stratified society. Workers owned homes, they took vacations, they sent children to college, their standard of living improved year by year. The American dream wasn't propaganda, it was observable reality for millions of ordinary Americans, and it was built on an economic system that Nazi ideology claimed would collapse under its own contradictions. Except it wasn't collapsing, it was thriving, producing such abundance that America could simultaneously fight a global war and improve civilian living standards. The prisoner experience ultimately proved that winning hearts and minds requires more than rhetoric. It requires demonstrable truth. The Americans didn't convince German prisoners through arguments. They convinced them through evidence. Every meal was evidence. Every medical treatment was evidence. Every paycheck for labor performed was evidence. Every night spent in warm, lit, clean barracks was evidence. Every book read, every class attended, every conversation with Americans who treated them as human beings rather than subhuman enemies was evidence. This accumulated evidence overwhelmed propaganda, overcome ideology, dissolved hatred. Not in every prisoner, there were holdouts, true believers who maintained Nazi faith despite everything. But in the vast majority, the transformation was total. They arrived as National Socialists and left as Democrats. They came as enemies and departed as friends. They entered as prisoners and emerged as ambassadors of a system they'd been taught to despise but learned to admire. The legacy lives on in modern Germany. The Federal Republic built after the war reflected democratic principles that former POWs championed. The social market economy combined capitalism with social welfare in ways these men had observed in America. The emphasis on education, on upward mobility, on treating citizens as individuals rather than subjects of the state, all reflected lessons learned in American captivity. West Germany's integration into the Atlantic Alliance wasn't just strategic necessity, it was philosophical alignment with principles that former prisoners had experienced and embraced. The friendship between America and Germany, so strong today that their wartime enmity seems ancient history, was built on foundations laid in those POW camps where enemies became friends through the simple act of treating each other with dignity. Standing in the memorial at Camp Concordia today, now a museum, you can read letters from former prisoners. One stands out. I came to America in chains and left free. Not free to go home. That came later. Free in my mind. Free from the lies I'd believed. Free from hatred. free to imagine a different future for my country. That freedom was the greatest gift America gave me. That prisoner became a teacher in post-war Germany, educating generations of children about democracy, about the dangers of totalitarianism, about the possibilities of freedom. He was one of thousands who carried similar messages home. Their collective impact reshaped a nation. The German POWs arrived expecting to find America weak. They found an industrial colossus. They expected exploitation and found abundance. They expected hatred and found humanity. Their captivity became education. Their defeat became enlightenment. Their imprisonment became liberation from an ideology built on lies. And in that transformation lies one of history's great lessons. The most powerful weapon isn't always military. Sometimes it's simply showing people a better way to live and letting them choose. The German POWs chose. And in choosing, they helped build the post-war world that rejected totalitarianism and embraced democracy. Not because they were forced to, but because they'd seen both systems up close and understood which one actually worked. The greatest victory America achieved in World War II wasn't on any battlefield. It was in the hearts and minds of men who came as enemies and left carrying the seeds of friendship that would bloom into alliance. That's the power of prosperity over propaganda. That's the triumph of example over force. That's what happens when you show people the truth and trust them to recognize it.